In the flesh. When Cleveland Smith returned to his cell after the interview with the landing officer, his new bunkmate was already in residence, staring at the dust-infested sunlight through the reinforced glass window. It was a short display. For less than half an hour each afternoon, clouds permitting, the sun found its way between the wall and the administration building and edged its way along the side of the B-wing, not to appear again until the following day. "You're Tate?" Cleve said. The prisoner looked away from the sun. Mayflower had said the new boy was 22, but Tate looked 5 years younger. He had the face of a lost dog, an ugly dog at that, a dog left by its owners to play in traffic. Eyes too wide, mouth too soft, arms too slender, a born victim. Cleve was irritated to have been encumbered with the boy. Tate was dead weight, and Cleve had no energies to expend on the boy's protection, despite Mayflower's pep talk about extending a welcoming hand. "Yes," the dog replied. "William." "People call you William?" "No," the boy said. "They call me Billy." "Billy." Cleve nodded and stepped into the cell. The regime at Pentonville was relatively enlightened. Cells were left open for 2 hours in the mornings and often 2 in the afternoon, allowing the cons some freedom of movement. The arrangement had its disadvantages, however, which was where Mayflower's talk came in. "I've been told to give you some advice," Cleve said. "Oh?" the boy replied. "You've not done time before?" "No." "Not even Borstal?" Tate's eyes flickered. "A little." "So you know what the score is. You know you're easy meat." "Sure." "Seems I've been volunteered," Cleve said without appetite, "to keep you from getting mauled." Tate stared at Cleve with eyes the blue of which was milky, as though the sun were still in them. "Don't put yourself out," the boy said. "You don't owe me anything." "Damn right I don't, but it seems I got a social responsibility," Cleve said sourly. "And you're it." Cleve was 2 months into his sentence for handling marijuana, his third visit to Pentonville. At 30 years of age, he was far from obsolete. His body was solid, his face lean and refined. In his court suit, he could have passed for a lawyer at 10 yards. A little closer, and the viewer might catch the scar on his neck, the result of an attack by a penniless addict, and a certain wariness in his gait, as if with every step forward he was keeping the option of a speedy retreat. "You're still a young man," the last judge had told him, "and still have time to change your spots." He hadn't disagreed out loud, but Cleve knew in his heart he was a leopard, born and bred. Crime was easy, work was not. Until somebody proved otherwise, he would do what he did best and take the consequences if caught. Doing time wasn't so unpalatable if you had the right attitude toward it. The food was edible, the company select. As long as he had something to keep his mind occupied, he was content enough. At present he was reading about sin. Now there was a subject. In his time he'd heard so many explanations of how it had come into the world, from probation officers and lawyers and priests. Theories sociological, theological, ideological. Some were worthy of a few minutes' consideration. Most were so absurd, sin from the womb, sin from the state, he laughed in their apologists' faces. None held water for long. It was a good bone to chew over, though. He needed a problem to occupy the days and nights. He slept badly in prison. It wasn't his guilt that kept him awake, but that of others. He was, after all, just a hash pusher, supplying wherever there was a demand, a minor cog in the consumerist machine. He had nothing to feel guilty about. But there were others here, many others it seemed, whose dreams were not so benevolent, nor nights so peaceful. They would cry, they would complain, they would curse judges, local and celestial. Their din would have kept the dead awake. "Is it always like this?" Billy asked Cleve after a week or so. A new inmate was making a ruckus down the landing. One moment tears, the next obscenities. "Yeah, most of the time," said Cleve. "Some of them need to yell a bit. It keeps their minds from curdling." "Not you," observed the unmusical voice from the bunk below. "You just read your books and keep out of harm's way. I've watched you. It doesn't bother you, does it?" "I can live with it," Cleve replied. "I got no wife to come here every week and remind me what I'm missing." "You been in before?" "Twice." The boy hesitated an instant before saying, "I suppose you know your way around the place, do you?" "Well, I'm not writing a guidebook, but I got the general layout by now." It seemed an odd comment for the boy to make. "Why?" "I just wondered," said Billy. "You got a question?" Tate didn't answer for several seconds, then said, I heard they used to hang people here." Whatever Cleve had been expecting the boy to come out with, that wasn't it. But then he had decided several days back that Billy Tate was a strange one. Sly, sidelong glances from those milky blue eyes, a way he had of staring at the wall or at the window like a detective at a murder scene, desperate for clues. Cleve said, "There used to be a hanging shed, I think." Again silence, and then another inquiry, dropped as lightly as the boy could contrive. "Is it still standing?" "The shed? I don't know. They don't hang people anymore, Billy, or hadn't you heard?" There was no reply from below. "What's it to you, anyhow?" "Just curious." Billy was right. Curious he was. So odd with his vacant stares and his solitary manner that most of the men kept clear of him. Only Lowell took any interest in him, and his motives for that were unequivocal. "You want to lend me your lady for the afternoon?" he asked Cleve while they waited in line for breakfast. Tate, who stood within earshot, said nothing. Neither did Cleve. "You hear me? I asked you a question." "I heard. You leave him alone." "Share and share alike," Lowell said. "I can do you some favors. We can work something out." "He's not available." "Well, why don't I ask him?" Lowell said, grinning through his beard. "What do you say, baby?" Tate looked around at Lowell. "I say no thank you." "No thank you," Lowell said, and gave Cleve a second smile, this one quite without humor. "You got him well trained. Does he sit up and beg, too?" "Take a walk, Lowell," Cleve replied. "He's not available, and that's all there is to it." "You can't keep your eyes on him every minute of the day," Lowell pointed out. "Sooner or later, he's going to have to stand on his own 2 feet, unless he's better kneeling." The innuendo won a guffaw from Lowell's cellmate, Naylor. Neither were men Cleve would have willingly faced in a free-for-all, but his skills as a bluffer were honed razor-sharp, and he used them now. "You don't want to trouble yourself," he told Lowell. "You can only cover so many scars with a beard." Lowell looked at Cleve. All humor fled. He clearly couldn't distinguish the truth from bluff, and equally clearly wasn't willing to put his neck on the line. "Just don't look the other way," he said, and said no more. The encounter at breakfast wasn't mentioned until that night, when the lights had been extinguished. It was Billy who brought it up. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "Lowell's a bad bastard. I've heard the talk." "You want to get raped then, do you?" "No," he said quickly. "Christ, no, I gotta be fit." "You'll be fit for nothing if Lowell gets his hands on you." Billy slipped out from his bunk and stood in the middle of the cell, barely visible in the gloom. "I suppose you want something in return," he said. Cleve turned on his pillow and looked at the uncertain silhouette, standing a yard from him. "What have you got that I'd want, Billy boy?" he said. What Lowell wanted? "Is that what you think that bluster was all about? Me staking a claim?" "Yeah." "Like you said. No, thank you." Cleve rolled over again to face the wall. I didn't mean... I don't care what you meant. I just don't want to hear about it, all right? You stay out of Lowell's way and don't give me shit." "Hey," Billy murmured, "don't get like that, please. Please. You're the only friend I've got." "I'm nobody's friend," Cleve said to the wall. "I just don't want any inconvenience. Understand me?" "No inconvenience," the boy repeated, dull-tongued. "Right. Now, I need my beauty sleep." Tate said no more, but returned to the bottom bunk and lay down, the springs creaking as he did so. Cleve lay in silence, turning the exchange over in his head. He had no wish to lay hands on the boy, but perhaps he had made his point too harshly. Well, it was done. From below, he could hear Billy murmuring to himself, almost inaudibly. He strained to eavesdrop on what the boy was saying. It took several seconds of ear-pricking attention before Cleve realized that Billy Boy was saying his prayers. Cleve dreamed that night. What of? He couldn't remember in the morning, though as he showered and shaved, tantalizing grains of the dream sifted through his head. Scarcely 10 minutes went by that morning without something. Salt overturned at the breakfast table, the sound of shouts in the exercise yard, promising to break his dream, but the revelation did not come. It left him uncharacteristically edgy and short-tempered. When Wesley, a small-time forger whom he knew from his previous vacation here, approached him in the library and started to talk as though they were bosom pals, Cleve told the runt to shut up, but Wesley insisted on speaking. "You got trouble." "Oh? How so?" "That boy of yours, Billy." "What about him?" "He's asking questions. He's getting pushy. People don't like it. They're saying you should take him in hand." "I'm not his keeper." Wesley pulled a face. "I'm telling you as a friend." "Spare me." "Don't be stupid, Cleveland. You're making enemies." "Oh?" said Cleve. "Name one." "Lowell," Wesley said, quick as a flash. "Naylor for another. All kinds of people. They don't like the way Tate is." "And how is he?" Cleve snapped back. Wesley made a small grunt of protest. "I'm just trying to tell you," he said. "He's sly, like a fucking rat. There'll be trouble. Spare me the prophecies." The law of averages demands the worst prophet be right some of the time. This was Wesley's moment, it seemed. The day after, coming back from the workshop where he'd exercised his intellect putting wheels on plastic cars, Cleve found Mayflower waiting for him on the landing. "I asked you to look after William Tate, Smith," the officer said. "Don't you give a damn?" "What happened?" "No, I suppose you don't." "I asked what happened, sir." "Nothing much. Not this time. He's been roughed up, that's all. Seems Lowell has a hankering after him. Am I right?" Mayflower peered at Cleve, and when he got no response, went on. "I made an error with you, Smith. I thought there was something worth appealing to under that hard man. My mistake." Billy was lying on the bunk, his face bruised, his eyes closed. He didn't open them when Cleve came in. "You okay?" "Sure," the boy said softly. "No bones broken?" "I'll survive." "You got to understand." "Listen." Billy opened his eyes. The pupils had darkened somehow, or that was the trick the light performed with them. "I'm alive, okay? I'm not an idiot, you know. I knew what I was letting myself in for coming here." He spoke as if he'd had a choice in the matter. "I can take Lowell," he went on, "so don't fret." He paused, then said, "You were right." "About what?" "About not having friends. I'm on my own. You're on your own, right? I'm just a slow learner, but I'm getting the hang of it." He smiled to himself. "You've been asking questions," Cleve said. "Oh, yeah?" Billy replied offhandedly. "Who says?" "If you've got questions, ask me. People don't like snoopers. They get suspicious. And then they turn their backs when Lowell and his like get heavy." Naming the man brought a painful frown to Billy's face. He touched his bruised cheek. "He's dead," the boy murmured, almost to himself. "Some chance," Cleve commented. The look that Tate returned could have sliced steel. "I mean it," he said, without a trace of doubt in his voice. "Lowell won't get out alive." Cleve didn't comment. The boy needed this show of bravado, laughable as it was. "What do you want to know that you go snooping around?" "Nothing much," Billy replied. He was no longer looking at Cleve, but staring at the bunk above. Quietly, he said, "I just wanted to know where the graves were, that's all." "The graves?" "Where they buried the men they'd hanged. Somebody told me there's a rose bush where Crippen's buried. You ever hear that?" Cleve shook his head. Only now did he remember the boy asking about the hanging shed, and now the graves. Billy looked up. The bruise was ripening by the minute. "You know where they are, Cleve?" he asked. Again, that feigned nonchalance. "I could find out if you do me the courtesy of telling me why you want to know." Billy looked out from the shelter of the bunk. The afternoon sun was describing its short arc on the painted brick of the cell wall. It was weak today. The boy slid his legs off the bunk and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the light as he had on that first day. "My grandfather, that is, My mother's father was hanged here, he said, his voice raw. In 1937. Edgar Tate. Edgar St. Clair Tate. I thought you said your mother's father. I took his name. I didn't want my father's name. I never belonged to him. Nobody belongs to anybody, Cleve replied. You're your own man. But that's not true, Billy said with a tiny shrug, still staring at the light on the wall. His certainty was immovable. The gentility with which he spoke did not undercut the authority of the statement. I belong to my grandfather. I always have. You weren't even born when he... That doesn't matter. Coming and going, that's nothing. Coming and going, Cleve puzzled. Did Tate mean life and death? He had no chance to ask. Billy was talking again, the same subdued but insistent flow. He was guilty, of course. Not the way they thought he was, but guilty. He knew what he was, and what he was capable of. That's guilt, isn't it? He killed 4 people, or at least that's what they hanged him for. You mean he killed more? Billy made another small shrug. Numbers didn't matter, apparently. But nobody came to see him when they laid him to rest. That's not right, is it? They didn't care, I suppose. All the family were glad he was gone, probably. Thought he was wrong in the head from the beginning. But he wasn't. I know he wasn't. I've got his hands and his eyes. So Mama said. She told me all about him, you see, just before she died. Told me things she'd never told anybody. And only told me because of my eyes. He faltered and put his hand to his lip, as if the fluctuating light on the brick had already mesmerized him into saying too much. What did your mother tell you? Cleve pressed him. Billy seemed to weigh up the alternative responses before offering one. Just that he and I were alike in some ways, he said. Crazy, you mean? Cleve said, only half joking. Something like that, Billy replied, eyes still on the wall. He sighed, then allowed himself a further confession. That's why I came here, so my grandfather would know he hadn't been forgotten. Came here? Said Cleve. What are you talking about? You were caught and sentenced. You had no choice. The light on the wall was extinguished as a cloud passed over the sun. Billy looked up at Cleve. The light was there in his eyes. I committed a crime to get here, the boy replied. It was a deliberate act. Cleve shook his head. The claim was preposterous. I tried before, twice. It's taken time, but I got here, didn't I? Don't take me for a fool, Billy, Cleve warned. I don't, the other replied. He stood up now. He seemed somehow lighter for the story he'd told. He even smiled, if tentatively, as he said, You've been good to me. Don't think I don't know that. I'm grateful. Now, he faced Cleve before saying, I want to know where the graves are. Find that out, and you won't hear another peep from me, I promise. Cleve knew next to nothing about the prisoner, its history, but he knew somebody who did. There was a man by the name of Bishop, so familiar with the inmates that his name had acquired the definite article, who was often at the workshop at the same time as Cleve. The Bishop had been in and out of prison for much of his 40-odd years, mostly for misdemeanors, and, with all the fatalism of a one-legged man who makes a study of monopedia, had become an expert on prisons and the penal system. Little of his information came from books. He had gleaned the bulk of his knowledge from old lags and screws who wanted to talk the hours away, and by degrees he had turned himself into a walking encyclopedia on crime and punishment. He had made it his trade, and he sold his carefully accrued knowledge by the sentence, sometimes as geographical information to the would-be escapee, sometimes as prison mythology to the godless con in search of a local divinity. Now Cleve sought him out and laid down his payment in tobacco and IOUs. What can I do for you? The Bishop asked. He was heavy, but not unhealthily so. The needle-thin cigarettes he was perpetually rolling and smoking were dwarfed by his butcher's fingers, stained sepia by nicotine. I want to know about the hangings here. The Bishop smiled. Such good stories, he said, and began to tell. On the plain details, Billy had been substantially correct. There had been hangings in Pentonville up until the middle of the century, but the shed had long since been demolished. On the spot now stood the probation office in B-Wing. As to the story of Crippen's roses, there was truth in that too. In front of a hut on the grounds, which, the bishop informed Cleve, was a store for gardening equipment, was a small patch of grass, in the center of which a bush flourished, planted, and at this point the bishop confessed that he could not tell fact from fiction, in memory of Dr. Crippen, hanged in 1910. "That's where the graves are?" Cleve asked. No, the bishop said, reducing half of one of the skinny cigarettes to ash with a single inhalation. "The graves are alongside the wall, to the left, behind the hut. There's a long lawn. You must have seen it." "No stones?" "Absolutely not. The plots have always been left unmarked. Only the governor knows who's buried where, and he's probably lost the plans." The bishop ferreted for his tobacco tin in the breast pocket of his prison-issue shirt and began to roll another cigarette with such familiarity he scarcely glanced down at what he was doing. "Nobody's allowed to come and mourn, you see. Out of sight, out of mind. That's the idea. Of course, that's not the way it works, is it? People forget prime ministers, but they remember murderers. You walk on that lawn, and just 6 feet under are some of the most notorious men who ever graced this green and pleasant land. Not even a cross to mark the spot. Criminal, isn't it?" "You know who's buried there?" "Some very wicked gentleman," the bishop replied, as if fondly admonishing them for their mischief-mongering. "You heard of a man called Edgar Tate?" Bishop raised his eyebrows, the fat of his brow furrowed. "St. Tate? Oh, certainly. He's not easily forgotten." "What do you know about it?" "Killed his wife, then his children. Took a knife to 'em all, as I live and breathe." "All?" The bishop put the freshly rolled cigarette to his thick lips. "Maybe not all," he said, narrowing his eyes as he tried to recall the specific details. "Maybe one of them survived. I think perhaps a daughter." He shrugged dismissively. "I'm not very good at remembering the victims, but then, who is?" He fixed his bland gaze on Cleve. "Why are you so interested in Tate? He was hanged before the war." 1937. He'll be well gone, eh?" The bishop raised a cautionary forefinger. "Not so," he said. "You see, the land this prison is built upon has special properties. Bodies buried here don't rot the way they do elsewhere." Cleve shot the bishop an incredulous glance. "It's true," the fat man protested mildly. "I have it on unimpeachable authority. Take it from me. Whenever they've had to exhume a body from the plot, it's always been found in almost perfect condition." He paused to light his cigarette and drew upon it, exhaling the smoke through his mouth with the next words. "When the end of the world is upon us, the good men of Marleybone and Camden Town will rise up as rot and bone. But the wicked, they'll dance to judgment as fresh as the day they dropped. Imagine that." This perverse notion clearly delighted him. His pudgy face puckered and dimpled with pleasure at it. "Ah," he mused, "and who'll be calling who corrupt on that fine morning?" Cleve never worked out precisely how Billy talked his way on to the gardening detail, but he managed it. Perhaps he had appealed directly to Mayflower, who'd persuaded his superiors that the boy could be trusted out in the fresh air. However he worked the maneuver, in the middle of the week following Cleve's discovery of the grave's whereabouts, Billy was out in the cold April morning cutting grass. What happened that day filtered back down the grapevine around recreation time. Cleve had the story from 3 independent sources, none of whom had been on the spot. The accounts had a variety of colorations, but were clearly the same species. The bare bones went as follows. The gardening detail, made up of 4 men watched over by a single prison guard, were moving around the blocks, trimming grass and weeding beds in preparation for the spring planting. Custody had been lax, apparently. It was 2 or 3 minutes before the guard even noticed that one of his charges had edged to the periphery of the party and slipped away. The alarm was raised. The guards did not have to look far, however. Tate had made no attempt to escape, or, if he had, he'd been stymied in his bid by a fit of some kind which had crippled him. He was found, and here the stories parted company considerably, on a large patch of lawn beside the wall, lying on the grass. Some reports claim he was black in the face, his body knotted up, and his tongue all but bitten through. Others said he was found face down, talking to the earth, weeping and cajoling. The consensus was that the boy had lost his mind. The rumors made Cleve the center of attention, a situation he did not relish. For the next day he was scarcely left alone, men wanting to know what it was like to share a cell with a lunatic. He had nothing to tell, he insisted. Tate had been the perfect cellmate, quiet, undemanding, and unquestionably sane. He told the same story to Mayflower when he was grilled the following day, and later to the prison doctor. He let not a breath of Tate's interest in the graves be known, and made it his business to see the bishop and request a similar silence of him. The man was willing to oblige, only if vouchsafed the full story in due course. This Cleve promised. The bishop, as befitted his assumed clerisy, was good as his word. Billy was gone for 2 days. In the interim, Mayflower disappeared from his duties as landing officer. No explanation was given. In his place, a man called Devlin was transferred from D-Wing. His reputation went before him. He was not, it seemed, a man of rare compassion. The impression was confirmed when the day of Billy Tate's return, Cleve was summoned into Devlin's office. "I'm told you and Tate are close," Devlin said. He had a face giving as granite. "Not really, sir." "I'm not going to make Mayflower's mistake, Smith. As far as I'm concerned, Tate's trouble. I'm going to watch him like a hawk, and when I'm not here, you're going to do it for me. Understand? Now, if he so much as crosses his eyes, it's the ghost train. I'll have him out of here and into a special unit before he can fart. Do I make myself clear?" Billy had lost weight in the hospital, pounds his scrawny frame could scarcely afford. His shirt hung off his shoulders, his belt was on its tightest notch. The thinning, more than ever, emphasized his physical vulnerability. A featherweight blow would floor him, Cleve thought. But it lent a new, almost desperate intensity to his face. He seemed all eyes, and those had lost all trace of captured sunlight. Gone, too, was the pretense of vacuity, replaced with an eerie purposefulness. "Paying your respects, were you?" Cleve said. Billy didn't answer. "I asked a question," Cleve repeated. "I heard you," Billy said. There was no sun today, but he looked at the wall anyway. "Yes, if you must know, I was paying my respects. I've been told to watch you by Devlin. He wants you off the landing, transferred entirely, maybe." "Out?" The panicked look Billy gave Cleve was too naked to be met for more than a few seconds. "Away from here, you mean?" "I would think so." "They can't." "Oh, they can. They call it the ghost train. 1 minute you're here, the next—" "No," the boy said, hands suddenly fists. He had begun to shake, and for a moment Cleve feared a second fit, but he seemed, by act of will, to control the tremors, and turned his look back to his cellmate. The bruises he'd received from Lowell had dulled to yellow-gray, but far from disappeared. His unshaven cheeks were dusted with pale ginger hair. Looking at him, Cleve felt an unwelcome twinge of concern. "Tell me," Cleve said. "Tell you what?" Billy asked. "What happened at the graves?" "I felt dizzy. I fell over. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital." "That's what you told them, isn't it?" "It's the truth." "Not the way I heard it. Why don't you explain what really happened? I want you to trust me." "I do," the boy said. "But I have to keep this to myself, see? It's between me and him." "You and Edgar?" Cleve asked, and Billy nodded. "A man who killed all his family but your mother?" Billy was clearly startled that Cleve possessed this information. "Yes," he said after consideration. "Yes, he killed them all. He would have killed Mama, too, if she hadn't escaped. He wanted to wipe the whole family out, so there'd be no heirs, to carry the bad blood." "Your blood's bad, is it?" Billy allowed himself the slenderest of smiles. "No," he said, "I don't think so. Grandfather was wrong. Times have changed, haven't they?" He is mad, Cleve thought. Lightning swift, Billy caught the judgment. "I'm not insane," he said. "You tell him that. Tell Devlin and whoever else asks. Tell them I'm a lamb." The fierceness was black in his eyes. There was nothing lamb-like there, though Cleve forbore saying so. "They mustn't move me out, Cleve, not after getting so close. I've got business here, important business." "With a dead man?" "With a dead man." Whatever new purpose he displayed for Cleve, The shutters went up when Billy got back among the rest of the cons. He responded neither to the questions nor the insults bandied about. His facade of empty-eyed indifference was flawless. Cleve was impressed. The boy had a future as an actor if he decided to forsake professional lunacy. But the strain of concealing the newfound urgency in him rapidly began to tell, in a hollowness about the eyes and a jitteriness in his movements, in brooding and unshakable silences. The physical deterioration was apparent to the doctor, to whom Billy continued to report. He pronounced the boy suffering from depression and acute insomnia and prescribed sedatives to aid sleep. These pills Billy gave to Cleve, insisting that he had no need of them himself. Cleve was grateful. For the first time in many months he began to sleep well, unperturbed by the tears and shouts of his fellow inmates. By day the relationship between him and the boy, which had always been vestigial, dwindled down to mere courtesy. Cleve sensed that Billy was closing up entirely, removing himself from mere physical concerns. It was not the first time he had witnessed such a premeditated withdrawal. His sister-in-law, Rosanna, had died of stomach cancer 3 years earlier, a protracted and, until the last weeks, steady decline. Cleve had not been close to her, but perhaps that very distance had lent him a perspective on the woman's behavior that the rest of the family had lacked. He had been startled at the systematic way she had prepared herself for death, drawing in her affections until they touched only the most vital figures in her life, her children and her priest, and exiling all others, including her husband of 14 years. Now he saw the same dispassion and frugality in Billy. Like a man in training to cross a waterless wasteland and too possessive of his energies to squander them in a single fruitless gesture, the boy was sinking into himself. It was eerie. Cleve became increasingly uncomfortable, sharing the 12 feet by 8 of the cell with Billy. It was like living with a man on death row. The only consolation was the tranquilizers, which Billy readily charmed the doctor into continuing to supply. They guaranteed Cleve sleep that was restful and, for several days at least, dreamless. And then he dreamed the city. Not the city first the desert, an empty expanse of blue-black sand, which stung the soles of his feet as he walked, and was blown up by a cool wind into his nose and eyes and hair. He had been here before, he knew. His dreamed self recognized the vista of barren dunes, with neither tree nor habitation to break the monotony. But on previous visits he had come with guides, or such was his half-formed belief. Now he was alone, and the clouds above his head were heavy, slate-gray, promising no sun. For what seemed hours he walked the dunes, his feet turned bloody by the sharp sand, his body, dusted by the grains, tinged blue. As exhaustion came close to defeating him, he saw ruins and approached them. It was no oasis. There was nothing in those empty streets of health or sustenance, no fruitful trees nor sparkling fountains. The city was a conglomeration of houses or parts of same, sometimes entire floors, sometimes single rooms, thrown down side by side in parodies of urban order. The styles were a hopeless mishmash, fine Georgian establishments standing beside mean tenement buildings with rooms burned out, a house plucked from a terraced row, perfect down to a glazed dog on the windowsill, back to back with a penthouse suite. All were scarred by a rough removal from their context. Walls were cracked, offering sly glimpses into private interiors, staircases beetled cloudward without destination, doors flapped open and closed in the wind, letting on to nowhere. There was life here, Cleve knew. Not just the lizards, rats, and butterflies, albinos all, that fluttered and skipped in front of him as he walked the forsaken streets, but human life. He sensed that every step he took was watched over, though he saw no sign of human presence, not on his first visit at least. On the second, his dream self forsook the trudge across the wilderness and was delivered directly into the necropolis, his feet, easily tutored, following the same route as he had on his first visit. The constant wind was stronger tonight. It caught the lace curtains in this window and a tinkling Chinese trinket hanging in that. It carried voices, too, horrid and outlandish sounds that came from some distant place far beyond the city. Hearing that whirring and whittering as of insane children, he was grateful for the streets and the rooms, for their familiarity, if not for any comfort they might offer. He had no desire to step into these interiors, voices or no. He did not want to discover what marked out these snatches of architecture, that they should have been ripped from their roots and flung down in this whining desolation. Yet once he had visited the site, his sleeping mind went back there, night upon night, always walking, bloody-footed, seeing only the lizards and the rats and the butterflies and the black sand on each threshold, blowing into rooms and hallways that never changed from visit to visit, that seemed, from what he could glimpse between the curtains or through a shattered wall, to have been fixed somehow at a pivotal moment, with a meal left uneaten on a table set for three, the capon uncarved, the sauces steaming, or a shower left running in the bathroom in which the lamp perpetually swung, and in a room that might have been a lawyer's study, a lapdog, or else a wig torn off and flung to the floor, lying discarded on a fine carpet whose intricacies were half devoured by sand. Only once did he see another human being in the city, and that was Billy. It happened strangely. One night as he dreamed the streets, he half stirred from sleep. Billy was awake and standing in the middle of the cell, staring up at the light through the window. It was not moonlight, but the boy bathed in it, as if it were. His face was turned up to the window, mouth open and eyes closed. Cleve barely had time to register the trance the boy seemed to be in before the tranquilizers drew him back into his dream. He took a fragment of reality with him, however, folding the boy into his sleeping vision. When he reached the city again, there was Billy Tate, standing on the street, his face turned up to the lowering clouds, his mouth open, his eyes closed. The image lingered only a moment. The next, the boy was away, his heels kicking up black fans of sand. Cleve called after him. Billy ran on, however, heedless, and with that inexplicable foreknowledge that dreams bring, Cleve knew where the boy was going. Off to the edge of the city, where the houses petered out and the desert began. Off to meet some friend, coming in on that terrible wind, perhaps. Nothing would induce him into pursuit, yet he didn't want to lose contact with the one fellow human he had seen in these destitute streets. He called Billy's name again, more loudly. This time he felt a hand on his arm and started up in terror to find himself being jostled awake in his cell. "It's all right," Billy said. "You're dreaming." Cleve tried to shake the city out of his head, but for several perilous seconds the dream bled into the waking world, and looking down at the boy, he saw Billy's hair lifted by a wind that did not, could not, belong in the confines of the cell. "You're dreaming," Billy said again. "Wake up." Shuddering, Cleve sat fully up on his bunk. The city was receding, was almost gone, but before he lost sight of it entirely, he felt the indisputable conviction that Billy knew what he was waking Cleve from, that they had been together for a few fragile moments. "You know, don't you?" he accused the pallid face at his side. The boy looked bewildered. "What are you talking about?" Cleve shook his head. The suspicion became more incredible with each step he took from sleep. Even so, when he looked down at Billy's bony hand, which still clung to his arm, he half expected to see flecks of that obsidian grit beneath his fingernails. There was only dirt. The doubts lingered, however, long after reason should have bullied them into surrender. Cleve found himself watching the boy more closely from that night on, watching for some slip of tongue or eye which would reveal the nature of his game. Such scrutiny was a lost cause. The last traces of accessibility disappeared that night. The boy became, like Rosanna, an indecipherable book, letting no clue as to the nature of his secret world out from beneath his lids. As to the dream, it was not even mentioned again. The only roundabout allusion to that night was Billy's redoubled insistence that Cleve continue to take the sedatives. "You need your sleep," he said, after coming back from the infirmary with a further supply. "Take them, Cleve." "You need sleep, too," Cleve replied, curious to know how far the boy would push the issue. "I don't need the stuff anymore." "But you do," Billy insisted, preferring the vial of capsules. "You know how bad the noise is." "Someone said they're addictive," Cleve replied, not taking the pills. "I'll do without." "No," said Billy. And now Cleve sensed a level of insistence which confirmed his deepest suspicions. The boy wanted him drugged, and had all along. "I sleep like a babe," Billy said. "Please take them. They'll only be wasted otherwise." Cleve shrugged. "If you're sure," he said, content, fears confirmed, to make a show of relenting. "I'm sure." "Then thanks." He took the vial. Billy beamed. With that smile, in a sense, the bad times really began. That night, Cleve answered the boy's performance with one of his own, appearing to take the tranquilizers as he usually did, but failing to swallow them. Once lying on his bunk, face to the wall, he slipped them from his mouth and under his pillow. Then he pretended to sleep. Prison days both began and finished early. By 8:45 or 9, most of the cells in the four wings were in darkness, the inmates locked up until dawn and left to their own devices. Tonight was quieter than most. The weeper in the next cell had been transferred to D-Wing. There were a few other disturbances along the landing. Even without the pill, Cleve felt sleep tempting him. From the bunk below his, he heard practically no sound, except for an occasional sigh. It was impossible to guess if Billy was actually asleep or not. Cleve kept his silence, occasionally stealing a moment-long glance at the luminous face of his watch. The minutes were leaden, and he feared, as the first hours crept by, that all too soon his imitation of sleep would become the real thing. Instead, he was turning this very possibility around in his mind, when unconsciousness overcame him. He awoke much later. His sleep position seemed not to have altered. The wall in front of him, the peeled paint like a dim map of some nameless territory. It took him a minute or two to orient himself. There was no sound from the bunk below. Disguising the gesture as one made in sleep, he drew his arm up within eye range and looked at the pale green dial of his watch. It was 1:51, several hours yet until dawn. He lay in the position he'd awakened in for a full quarter of an hour, listening for every sound in the cell, trying to locate Billy. He was loath to roll over and look for himself, for fear that the boy was standing in the middle of the cell as he had been the night of the visit to the city. The world, though benighted, was far from silent. He could hear dull footsteps as somebody paced back and forth in the corresponding cell on the landing above. He could hear water rushing in the pipes and the sound of a siren on Caledonian Road. What he couldn't hear was Billy, not a breath of the boy. Another quarter of an hour passed, and Cleve could feel the familiar torpor closing in to reclaim him. If he lay still much longer, he would fall asleep again, and the next thing he'd know it would be morning. If he was going to learn anything, he had to roll over and look. Wisest, he decided, not to attempt to move surreptitiously, but to turn over as naturally as possible. This he did, muttering to himself as if in sleep, to add weight to the illusion. Once he had turned completely and positioned his hand beside his face to shield his spying, he cautiously opened his eyes. The cell seemed darker than it had the night he had seen Billy with his face up to the window. As to the boy, he was not visible. Cleve opened his eyes a little wider and scanned the cell as best he could from between his fingers. There was something amiss, but he couldn't quite work out what it was. He lay there for several minutes, waiting for the eyes to become accustomed to the murk. They didn't. The scene in front of him remained unclear, like a painting so encrusted with dirt and varnish, its depth refused the investigating eye. Yet he knew that the shadows in the corner of the cell and on the opposite wall were not empty. He wanted to end the anticipation that was making his heart thump, wanted to raise his head from the pebble-filled pillow and call Billy out of hiding, but good sense counseled otherwise. Instead, he lay still and sweated and watched. And now he began to realize what was wrong with the scene before him. The concealing shadows fell where no shadows belonged. They spread across the floor where the feeble light from the window should have been falling. Somehow, between window and wall, that light had been choked and devoured. Cleve closed his eyes to give his befuddled mind a chance to rationalize and reject this conclusion. When he opened them again, his heart lurched. The shadow, far from losing potency, had grown a little. He had never been afraid like this before, never felt a coldness in his innards akin to the chill that found him now. It was all he could do to keep his breath even and his hands where they lay. His instinct was to wrap himself up and hide his face like a child. Two thoughts kept him from doing so. One was that the slightest movement might draw unwelcome attention to him. The other, that Billy was somewhere in the cell, and perhaps as threatened by this living darkness as he. And then, from the bunk below, the boy spoke. His voice soft, presumably so as not to awake his sleeping cellmate. It was also eerily intimate. Cleve entertained no thought that Billy was talking in his sleep. The time for willful self-deception was long past. The boy was addressing the darkness. Of that unpalatable fact, there could be no doubt. "It hurts," he said, with a faint note of accusation. "You didn't tell me how much it hurts." Was it Cleve's imagination, or did the wraith of shadows bloom a little in response, like a squid's ink in water? He was horribly afraid. The boy was speaking again. His voice was so low, Cleve could barely catch the words. He said with quiet urgency, "I'm not afraid. Not afraid." Again the shadow lifted. This time, when Cleve looked into its heart, he made some sense of the chimerical form it embraced. His throat shook, a cry lodged behind his tongue, hot to be shouted. "All you can teach me," Billy was saying. "Quickly." The words came and went, but Cleve barely heard them. His attention was on the curtain of shadow and the figure, stitched from darkness, that moved in its folds. It was not an illusion. There was a man there, or rather a crude copy of one, its substance tenuous, its outline deteriorating all the time and being hauled back into some semblance of humanity again only with the greatest effort. Of the visitor's features, Cleve could see little, but enough to sense deformities paraded like virtues. A face resembling a plate of rotted fruit, pulpy and peeling, swelling here with a nest of flies, and there suddenly fallen away to a pestilent core. How could the boy bring himself to converse so easily with such a thing? And yet, putrescence notwithstanding, there was a bitter dignity in the bearing of the creature, in the anguish of its eyes, in the toothless O of its maw. Suddenly Billy stood up. The abrupt movement after so many hushed words almost unleashed the cry from Cleve's throat. He swallowed it with difficulty and closed his eyes down to a slit, staring through the bars of his lashes at what happened next. Billy was talking again, but now the voice was too low to allow for eavesdropping. He stepped toward the shadow, his body blocking much of the figure on the opposite wall. The cell was no more than 2 or 3 strides wide, but by some mellowing of physics, the boy seemed to take 5, 6, 7 steps away from the bunk. Cleve's eyes widened. He knew he was not being watched. The shadow and its acolyte had business between them. It occupied their attention utterly.
End side 1. Please fast forward and turn the cassette over.
Billy's figure was smaller than seemed possible within the confines of the cell, as if he had stepped through the wall into some other province. And only now, with his eyes wide, did Cleve recognize that place. The darkness from which Billy's visitor was made was cloud shadow and dust. Behind him, barely visible in the bewitched murk, but recognizable to anyone who had been there, was the city of Cleve's dreams. Billy had reached his master. The creature towered above him, tattered and spindly, but aching with power. Cleve didn't know how or why the boy had gone to it, and he feared for Billy's safety now that he had, but fear for his own safety shackled him to the bunk. He realized in that moment that he had never loved anyone, man or woman, sufficiently to pursue them into the shadow of that shadow. The thought brought a terrible isolation, knowing that same instant that none, seeing him walk to his damnation, would take a single step to claim him from the brink. Lost souls both, he and the boy. Now Billy's lord was lifting his swollen head, and the incessant wind in those blue streets was rousing his horse mane into furious life. On the wind, the same voices Cleve had heard carried before, the cries of mad children, somewhere between howls and tears. As if encouraged by these voices, the entity reached out toward Billy and embraced him, wrapping the boy round in vapor. Billy did not struggle in his embrace, but rather returned it. Cleve, unable to watch this horrid intimacy, closed his eyes against it. And when, seconds, minutes later, he opened them again, the encounter seemed to be over. The shadow thing was blowing apart, relinquishing its slender claim to coherence. It fragmented, pieces of its tattered anatomy flying off into the streets like litter before the wind. Its departure seemed to signal the dispersal of the entire scene. The streets and houses were already being devoured by dust and distance. Even before the last of the shadow's scraps had been wafted out of sight, the city was lost to sight. Cleve was pleased to be rid of it. Reality, grim as it was preferable to that desolation. Brick by painted brick, the wall was asserting itself again, and Billy, delivered from his master's arms, was back in the solid geometry of the cell, staring up at the light through the window. Cleve did not sleep again that night. Indeed, he wondered, lying on his unyielding mattress and staring up at the stalactites of paint depending from the ceiling, whether he could ever again find safety in sleep. Sunlight was a showman. It threw its brightness down with such flamboyance, eager as any tinsel merchant to dazzle and distract. But beneath the gleaming surface it illuminated was another state, one that sunlight, ever the crowd-pleaser, conspired to conceal. It was vile and desperate, that condition. Most, blinded by sight, never even glimpsed it. But Cleve knew the state of sunlessness now. He even walked it, in dreams. And though he mourned the loss of his innocence, he knew he could never retrace the steps back into the light's hall of mirrors. He tried his damnedest to keep this change in him from Billy. The last thing he wanted was for the boy to suspect his eavesdropping. But concealment was well nigh impossible. Though the following day Cleve made every show of normality he could contrive, he could not quite cover his unease. It slipped out without his being able to control it, like sweat from his pores, and the boy knew no doubt of it. He knew. Nor was he slow to give voice to his suspicions. When following the afternoon's workshop they returned to their cell, Billy was quick to come to the point. "What's wrong with you today?" Cleve busied himself with remaking his bed, afraid even to glance at Billy. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I don't feel particularly well, that's all." "You have a bad night?" the boy inquired. Cleve could feel Billy's eyes boring into his back. "No," he said, pasting his denial so that it didn't come out too quickly. "I took your pills, like always." "Good." The exchange faltered, and Cleve was allowed to finish his bed-making in silence. The business could only be extended so long, however. When he turned from the bunk, job done, he found Billy sitting at the small table, with one of Cleve's books open in his lap. He casually flicked through the volume. All sign of his previous suspicion vanished. Cleve knew better than to trust mere appearances, however. "Why do you read these things?" the boy asked. "Passes the time," Cleve replied, undoing all his labors by clambering up onto the top bunk and stretching out there. "No, I don't mean, why do you read books? I mean, why do you read these books? All this stuff about sin." Cleve only half heard the question. Lying there on his bunk reminded him all too acutely of how the night had been. Reminded him, too, that darkness was even now crawling up the side of the world again. And at that thought, his stomach seemed to aspire to his throat. "Did you hear me?" the boy asked. Cleve murmured that he had. "Well, why then? Why the books? About damnation and all." "Nobody else takes him out of the library," Cleve replied, having difficulty shaping thoughts to speak when the others, unspoken, were so much more demanding. "You don't believe it, then?" "No," he replied, "I don't believe a word of it." The boy kept his silence for a while. Though Cleve wasn't looking at him, he could hear Billy turning pages. Then, another question, but spoken more quietly. Confession. "Do you ever get afraid?" The inquiry startled Cleve from his trance. The conversation had changed back from talk of reading matter to something altogether more pertinent. Why did Billy ask about fear, unless he too was afraid? "What have I got to be scared of?" Cleve asked. From the corner of his eye he caught the boy shrugging slightly before replying. "Things that happen," he said, his voice soulless. "Things you can't control." "Yes," Cleve replied, not certain of where this exchange was leading. "Yes, of course, sometimes I'm scared." "What do you do then?" Billy asked. "Nothing to do, is there?" Cleve's voice was as hushed as Billy's. "I gave up praying the morning my father died." He heard the soft pat as Billy closed the book and inclined his head sufficiently to catch sight of the boy. Billy could not entirely conceal his agitation. "He is afraid," Cleve saw. "He doesn't want the night to come any more than I do." He found the thought of their shared fear reassuring. Perhaps the boy didn't entirely belong to the shadow. Perhaps he could even cajole Billy into pointing their route out of this spiraling nightmare. He sat upright, his head within inches of the cell ceiling. Billy looked up from his meditations, his face a pallid oval of twitching muscle. Now was the time to speak. Cleve knew, now, before the lights were switched out along the landings, and all the cells consigned to shadows. There would be no time then for explanations. The boy would already be half lost to the city and beyond persuasion. "I have dreams," Cleve said. Billy said nothing but simply stared back, hollow-eyed. "I dream a city." The boy didn't flinch. He clearly wasn't going to volunteer elucidation. He would have to be bullied into it. "Do you know what I'm talking about?" Billy shook his head. "No," he said lightly. "I never dream." "Everybody dreams." "Then I just don't remember 'em." "I remember mine," Cleve said. He was determined, now that he'd broached the subject, not to let Billy squirm free. "And you're there. You're in that city." Now the boy flinched. Only a treacherous lash, but enough to reassure Cleve that he wasn't wasting his breath. "What is that place, Billy?" he asked. "How should I know?" the boy returned, about to laugh, then discarding the attempt. "I don't know, do I? They're your dreams." Before Cleve could reply, he heard the voice of one of the guards as he moved along the row of cells, telling the men to bed down for the night. Very soon the lights would be extinguished, and he would be locked up in this narrow cell for 10 hours, with Billy and phantoms. "Last night," he said, fearful of mentioning what he'd heard and seen without due preparation, but more fearful still of facing another night on the borders of the city, alone in darkness. "Last night I saw—" He faltered. Why wouldn't the words come? "Saw—" "Saw what?" the boy demanded, his face inscrutable. Whatever sign of apprehension there had been in it had now vanished. Perhaps he too had heard the guards advance and known that there was nothing to be done, no way of staying the night's advance. "What did you see?" Billy insisted. Cleve sighed. "My mother," he replied. The boy betrayed his relief only in the tenuous smile that crept across his lips. "Yeah, I saw my mother, large as life." "And it upset you, did it?" Billy asked. "Sometimes dreams do." The guard had reached B, 320. "Lights out in 2 minutes," he said as he passed. "You should take some more of those pills," Billy advised, putting down the book and crossing to his bunk. "Then you'd be like me. No dreams." Cleve had lost. He, the arch bluffer, had been out-bluffed by the boy, and now had to take the consequences. He lay facing the ceiling, counting off the seconds until the light went out, while below the boy undressed and slipped between the sheets. There was still time to jump up and call the guard back, time to beat his head against the door until somebody came. But what would he say to justify his histrionics? That he had bad dreams? Who didn't? That he was afraid of the dark? Who wasn't? They would laugh in his face and tell him to go back to bed, leaving him with all camouflage blown and the boy and his master waiting at the wall. There was no safety in such tactics. Nor in prayer either. He had told Billy the truth about his giving up God when his prayers for his father's life had gone unanswered. Of such divine neglect was atheism made. Belief could not be rekindled now, however profound his terror. Thoughts of his father led inevitably to thoughts of childhood. Few other subjects, if any, could have engrossed his mind sufficiently to steal him from his fears but this. When the lights were finally extinguished, his frightened mind took refuge in memories. His heart rate slowed, his fingers ceased to tremble, and eventually, without his being the least aware of it, sleep stole him. The distractions available to his conscious mind were not available to his unconscious. Once asleep, fond recollection was banished. Childhood memories became a thing of the past, and he was back, bloody-footed, in that terrible city. Or rather, on its borders. For tonight he did not follow the familiar route past the Georgian house and its attendant tenements, but walked instead to the outskirts of the city, where the wind was stronger than ever and the voices it carried clear. Though he expected with every step he took to see Billy and his dark companion, he saw nobody. Only butterflies accompanied him along the path, luminous as his watch face. They settled on his shoulders and his hair like confetti, then fluttered off again. He reached the edge of the city without incident and stood, scanning the desert. The clouds, solid as ever, moved overhead with the majesty of juggernauts. The voices seemed closer tonight, he thought, and the passions they expressed less distressing than he had found them previously. Whether the mellowing was in them or in his response to them, he couldn't be certain. And then, as he watched the dunes and the sky, mesmerized by their blankness, he heard a sound and glanced over his shoulder to see a smiling man, dressed in what was surely his Sunday finery, walking out of the city toward him. He was carrying a knife. The blood on it, and on his hand and shirt front, was wet. Even in his dream state, and immune, Cleve was intimidated by the sight, and stepped back, a word of self-defense on his lips. The smiling man seemed not to see him, however, but advanced past Cleve and out into the desert, dropping the blade as he crossed some invisible boundary. Only now did Cleve see that others had done the same, and that the ground at the city limit was littered with lethal keepsakes, knives, ropes, even a human hand lopped off at the wrist, most of which were all but buried. The wind was bringing the voices again, tatters of senseless songs and half-finished laughter. He looked up from the sand. The exiled man had gone out 100 yards from the city and was now standing on top of one of the dunes, apparently waiting. The voices... Call him, Cleve thought. Did the old man need summoning from his resting place every night? Was that what he had seen Billy doing, standing in the middle of the cell, eyes closed and face up to the window? If so, perhaps the boy could be prevented from putting in his call to the dead. As the evening deepened, Cleve lay on his bunk and thought his options through. Was it better to wait here and see what judgment came for Tate, or attempt to take control of the situation and block the old man's arrival? If he did so, there would be no going back, no room for pleas or apologies. His aggression would undoubtedly breed aggression. If he failed to prevent the boy from calling Tate, it would be the end. The lights went out. In cells up and down the 5 landings of B-Wing, men would be turning their faces to their pillows. Some, perhaps, would lie awake, planning their careers when this minor hiccup in their professional lives was over. Others would be in the arms of invisible mistresses. Cleve listened to the sounds of the cell, the rattling progress of water in the pipes, the shallow breathing from the bunk below. Sometimes it seemed that he had lived a second lifetime on this stale pillow, marooned in darkness. The breathing from below soon became practically inaudible, nor was there any sound of movement. Perhaps Billy was waiting for Cleve to fall asleep before he made any move. If so, the boy would wait in vain. He would not close his eyes and leave them to slaughter him in his sleep. He wasn't a pig to be taken uncomplaining to the knife. Moving as cautiously as possible so as to arouse no suspicion, Cleve unbuckled his belt and pulled it through the loops of his trousers. He might make a more adequate binding by tearing up his sheet and pillowcase, but he could not do so without arousing Billy's attention. Now he waited, belt in hand, and pretended to sleep. Tonight he was grateful that the noise in the wing kept stirring him from dozing, because it was fully 2 hours before Billy moved out of his bunk, 2 hours in which, despite his fear of what would happen should he sleep, Cleve's eyelids betrayed him on 3 or 4 occasions. But others on the landings were tearful tonight. The deaths of Lowell and Naylor had made even the toughest cons jittery. Shouts and counter-calls from those awakened punctuated the hours. Despite the fatigue in his limbs, sleep did not master him. When Billy finally got up from the lower bunk, it was well past 12 and the landing was all but quiet. Cleve could hear the boy's breath. It was no longer even, but had a catch in it. He watched, eyes like slits, as Billy crossed the cell to his familiar place in front of the window. There was no doubt that he was about to call up the old man. As Billy closed his eyes, Cleve sat up, threw off his blanket, and slipped down from the bunk. The boy was slow to respond. Before he quite comprehended what was happening, Cleve had crossed the cell and thrust him back against the wall, hand clamped over Billy's mouth. "No, you don't," Cleve growled. "I'm not going to go like Lowell." Billy struggled, but Cleve was easily his physical superior. "He's not going to come tonight," Cleve said, staring into the boy's wide eyes, "because you're not going to call him." Billy fought more violently to be free, biting hard against his captor's palm. Cleve instinctively removed his hand, and in 2 strides the boy was at the window, reaching up. In his throat, a strange half-song, on his face, sudden and inexplicable tears. Cleve dragged him away. "Shut your noise up," he snapped, but the boy continued to make the sound. Cleve hit him, open-handed but hard, across the face. "Shut up," he said. Still the boy refused to cease his singing. Now the music had taken on another rhythm. Again Cleve hit him, and again, but the assault failed to silence him. There was a whisper of change in the air of the cell. The shadows were moving. Panic took Cleve. Without warning, he made a fist and punched the boy hard in the stomach. As Billy doubled up, an uppercut caught his jaw. It drove his head back against the wall, his skull connecting with the brick. Billy's legs gave and he collapsed. A featherweight, Cleve had once thought, and it was true. 2 good punches and the boy was laid out cold. Cleve glanced around the cell. The movement in the shadows had been arrested. They trembled, though, like greyhounds awaiting release. Hard hammering, he carried Billy back to his bunk and laid him down. There was no sign of consciousness returning. The boy lay limply on the mattress while Cleve tore up his sheet and gagged him, thrusting a ball of fabric into the boy's mouth to prevent him from making a sound behind his gag. He then proceeded to tie Billy to the bunk, using both his own belt and the boy's, supplemented with further makeshift bindings of torn sheets. It took several minutes to finish the job. As Cleve was lashing the boy's legs together, Billy began to stir. His eyes flickered open, full of puzzlement. Then, realizing his situation, he began to thrash his head from side to side. There was little else he could do to signal his protest. "No, Billy," Cleve murmured to him, throwing a blanket across his bound body to keep the fact from any guard who might look in through the peephole. "Tonight you don't bring him. Everything I said was true, boy. He wants out and he's using you to escape." Cleve took hold of Billy's head, fingers pressed against his cheeks. "He's not your friend. I am. Always have been." Billy tried to shake his head from Cleve's grip, but couldn't. "Don't waste your energy," Cleve advised. "It's going to be a long night." He left the boy on his bunk, crossed the cell to the wall, and slid down it to sit on his haunches and watch. He would stay awake until dawn, and then, when there was some light to think by, he'd work out his next move. For now, he was content that his crude tactics had worked. The boy had stopped trying to fight. He had clearly realized the bonds were too expertly tied to be loosened. A kind of calm descended on the cell. Cleve, sitting in the patch of light that fell through the window, the boy, lying in the gloom of the lower bunk, breathing steadily through his nostrils. Cleve glanced at his watch. It was 12:54. When was morning? He didn't know. 5 hours at least. He put his head back and stared at the light. It mesmerized him. The minutes ticked by slowly but steadily, and the light did not change. Sometimes a guard would advance along the landing, and Billy, hearing the footsteps, would begin his struggling afresh. But nobody looked into the cell. The 2 prisoners were left to their thoughts. Cleve to wonder if there would ever come a time when he would be free of the shadow behind him. Billy to think whatever thoughts came to bound monsters. And still, the dead of night minutes went, minutes that crept across his mind like dutiful schoolchildren, one upon the heels of the next, and after 60 had passed, that sum was called an hour. And dawn was closer by that span, wasn't it? But then so was death, and so presumably the end of the world, that glorious last trump of which the bishop had spoken so fondly, when the dead men under the lawn outside would rise as fresh as yesterday's bread and go out to meet their Maker. And sitting there against the wall, listening to Billy's inhalations and exhalations, and watching the light in the glass and through the glass, Cleve knew without a doubt that even if he escaped this trap, it was only a temporary respite, that this long night, its minutes, its hours, were a foretaste of a longer vigil. He almost despaired then, felt his soul sink into a hole from which there seemed to be no hope of retrieval. Here was the real world, he wept. Not joy, not light, not looking forward, only this waiting in ignorance, without hope, even of fear, for fear came only to those with dreams to lose. The hole was deep and dim. He peered out of it at the light, through the window, and his thoughts became one wretched round. He forgot the bunk and the boy lying there. He forgot the numbness that had overtaken his legs. He might, given time, have forgotten even the simple act of taking breath but for the smell of urine that pricked him from his tongue. He looked toward the bunk. The boy was voiding his bladder, but the act was simply a symptom of something else altogether. Beneath the blanket, Billy's body was moving in a dozen ways that his bonds should have prevented. It took Cleve a few moments to shake off lethargy, and seconds more to realize what was happening. Billy was changing. Cleve tried to stand upright, but his lower limbs were dead from sitting still for so long. He almost fell forward across the cell and only prevented himself by throwing out an arm to grasp the chair. His eyes were glued to the gloom of the lower bunk. The movements were increasing in scale and complexity. The blanket was pitched off. Beneath it, Billy's body was already beyond recognition. The same terrible procedure as he had seen before, but in reverse. Matter gathering in buzzing clouds about the body and congealing into atrocious forms. Limbs and organs summoned from the ineffable. Teeth shaping themselves like needles and plunging into place in a head grown large and swelling still. He begged for Billy to stop, but with every drawn breath there was less humanity to appeal to. The strength the boy had lacked was granted to the beast. It had already broken almost all its constraints, and now, as Cleve watched, it struggled free of the last and rolled off the bunk onto the floor of the cell. Cleve backed off toward the door, his eyes scanning Billy's mutated form. He remembered his mother's horror at earwigs and saw something of that insect in this anatomy. The way it bent its shiny back upon itself, exposing the paddling intricacies that lined its abdomen. Elsewhere, no analogy offered to hold on the sight. Its head was rife with tongues that licked its eyes clean in place of lids and ran back and forth across its teeth, wetting and re-wetting them constantly. From seeping holes along its flanks came a sewer stench. Yet even now there was a residue of something human trapped in this foulness, its rumor only serving to heighten the filth of the whole. Seeing its hooks and its spines, Cleve remembered Lowell's rising scream and felt his own throat pulse, ready to loose a sound its equal should the beast turn on him. But Billy had other intentions. He moved, limbs in horrible array, to the window and clambered up, pressing his head against the glass like a leech. The music he made was not like his previous song, but Cleve had no doubt it was the same summoning. He turned to the door and began to beat upon it, hoping that Billy would be too distracted with his call to turn on him before assistance came. "Quick, for Christ's sake, quick!" he yelled as loudly as exhaustion would allow, and glanced over his shoulder once to see if Billy was coming for him. He was not. He was still clamped to the window, though his call had all but faltered. Its purpose was achieved. Darkness was tyrant in the cell. Panicking, Cleve turned back to the door and renewed his tattoo. There was somebody running along the landing now. He could hear shouts and imprecations from other cells. "Jesus Christ, help me!" he shouted. He could feel a chill at his back. He didn't need to turn to know what was happening behind him. The shadow was growing, the wall dissolving so that the city and its occupant could come through. Tate was here. He could feel the man's presence, vast and dark. Tate, the child killer. Tate, the shadow thing. Tate, the transformer. Cleve beat on the door till his hands bled. The feet seemed a continent away. Were they coming? Were they coming? The chill behind him became a blast. He saw his shadow thrown up onto the door by flickering blue light, smelled sand and blood. And then, the voice, not the boy, but that of his grandfather, of Edgar St. Clair Tate. This was the man who had pronounced himself the devil's excrement. And hearing the abhorrent voice, Cleve believed both in hell and its master, believed himself already in the bowels of Satan, a witness to its wonders. "You are too inquisitive," Edgar said. "It's time you went to bed." Cleve didn't want to turn. The last thought in his head was that he should turn and look at the speaker, but he was no longer subject to his own will. Tate had fingers in his head and was dabbling there. He turned and looked. The hanged man was in the cell. He was not that beast Cleve had half seen, that face of pulp and eggs. He was here in the flesh, dressed for another age, and not without charm. His face was well made now, his brow wide, his eyes unflinching. He still wore his wedding ring on the hand that stroked Billy's bowed head like that of a pet dog. "Time to die, Mr. Smith," he said. On the landing outside, Cleve heard Devlin shouting. He had no breath left to answer with, but he heard keys in the lock, or was it some illusion his mind had made to placate his panic? The tiny cell was full of wind. It threw over the chair and table and lifted the sheets into the air like childhood ghosts. And now it took Tate and the boy with him, sucked them back into the receding perspectives of the city. "Come on now," Tate demanded, his face corrupting. "We need you, body and soul. Come with us, Mr. Smith. We won't be denied." "No!" Cleve yelled back at his tormentor. The suction was plucking at his fingers, at his eyeballs. "I won't!" Behind him, the door was rattling. "I won't, you hear?" Suddenly the door was thrust open and threw him forward into the vortex of fog and dust that was sucking Tate and his grandchild away. He almost went with them but for a hand that grabbed at his shirt and dragged him back from the brink, even as consciousness gave itself up. Somewhere, far away, Devlin began to laugh like a hyena. He's lost his mind, Cleve decided, and the image his darkening thoughts evoked was one of the contents of Devlin's brain escaping through his mouth like a flock of flying dogs. awoke, in dreams, and in the city. He awoke remembering his last conscious moments. Devlin's hysteria, the hand arresting his fall as the two figures were sucked away in front of him. He had followed them, it seemed, unable to prevent his comatose mind from retreading the familiar route to the murderer's metropolis. But Tate had not won yet. He was still only dreaming his presence here. His corporeal self was still in Pentonville. His dislocation from it informed his every step. He listened to the wind. It was eloquent as ever, the voices coming and going along with each gritty gust, but never, even when the wind died to a whisper, disappearing entirely. As he listened, he heard a shout. In this mute city, the sound was a shock. It startled rats from their nests and birds up from some secluded plaza. Curious, he pursued the sound, whose echoes were almost traced on the air. As he hurried down the empty streets, he heard further raised voices, and now men and women were appearing at the doors and windows of their cells. So many faces, and nothing in common between one and the next to confirm the hopes of a physiognomist. Murder had as many faces as it had occurrences. The only common quality was one of wretchedness, of minds despairing after an age at the sight of their crime. He glanced at them as he went, sufficiently distracted by their looks not to notice where the shout was leading him, until he found himself once more in the ghetto to which he had been led by the child. Now he rounded a corner, and at the end of the cul-de-sac he'd seen from his previous visit here, the wall, the window, the bloody chamber beyond, he saw Billy writhing in the sand at Tate's feet. The boy was half himself and half that beast he had become in front of Cleve's eyes. The better part was convulsing in an attempt to climb free of the other, but without success. In one moment the boy's body would surface, white and frail, only to be subsumed the next into the flux of transformation. Was that an arm forming and being snatched away again before it could gain fingers? Was that a face pressed from the house of tongues that was the beast's head? The sight defied analysis. As soon as Cleve fixed upon some recognizable feature, it was drowned again. Edgar Tate looked up from the struggle in front of him and bared his teeth at Cleve. It was a display a shark might have envied. "He doubted me, Mr. Smith," the monster said, "and came looking for his cell." A mouth appeared from the patchwork on the sand and gave out a sharp cry, full of pain and terror. "Now he wants to be away from me," Tate said. "You sowed the doubt. He must suffer the consequences." He pointed a trembling finger at Cleve, and in the act of pointing the limb transformed, flesh becoming bruised leather. "You came where you were not wanted, and look at the agonies you've brought." Tate kicked the thing at his feet. It rolled over onto its back, vomiting. "He needs me," Tate said. "Don't you have the sense to see that? Without me, he's lost." Cleve didn't reply to the hanged man, but instead addressed the beast on the sand. "Billy," he said, calling the boy out of the flux. "Lost," Tate said. "Billy," Cleve repeated, "listen to me." "You won't go back now," Tate said. "You're just dreaming this, but he's here, in the flesh." "Billy," Cleve persevered, "do you hear me? It's me. It's Cleve." The boy seemed to pause in his gyrations for an instant, as if hearing the appeal. Cleve said Billy's name again and again. It was one of the first skills the human child learned, to call itself something. If anything could reach the boy, it was surely his own name. "Billy? Billy?" At the repeated word, the body rolled itself over. Tate seemed to have become uneasy. The confidence he displayed was now silenced. His body was darkening, his head becoming bulbous. Cleve tried to keep his eyes off the subtle distortions in Edgar's anatomy and concentrate on winning Billy back. The repetition of the same was paying dividends. The beast was being subdued. Moment by moment, there was more of the boy emerging. He looked pitiful, skin and bones on the black sand, but his face was almost reconstructed now, and his eyes were on Cleve. "Billy?" He nodded. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. His limbs were in a spasm. "You know where you are? Who you are?" At first it seemed as though comprehension escaped the boy, and then, by degrees, recognition formed in his eyes, and with it came the terror of the man standing over him. Cleve glanced up at Tate. In the few seconds since he had last looked, all but a few human characteristics had been erased from his head and upper torso, revealing corruptions more profound than those of his grandchild. Billy gazed up over his shoulder, like a whipped dog. "You belong to me," Tate pronounced, through features barely capable of speech. Billy saw the limbs descending to snatch at him and rose from his prone position to escape them, but he was too late. Cleve saw the spiked hook of Tate's limb wrap itself around Billy's neck and draw him close. Blood leapt from the slit windpipe, and with it the whine of escaping air. Cleve yelled. "With me," Tate said, the words deteriorating into gibberish. Suddenly the narrow cul-de-sac was filling up with brightness, and the boy and Tate and the city were being bleached out. Cleve tried to hold on to them, but they were slipping from him, and in their place another concrete reality. A light, a face, faces, and a voice calling him out of one absurdity and into another. The doctor's hand was on his face. It felt clammy. "What on earth were you dreaming about?" he asked. The perfect idiot. Billy had gone. Of all the mysteries that the governor and Devlin and the other guards who had stepped into cell B320 that night had to face, the total disappearance of William Tate from an unbreached cell was the most perplexing. Of the vision that had set Devlin giggling like a loon, nothing was said. Easier to believe in some collective delusion than that they'd seen some objective reality. When Cleve attempted to articulate the events of that night, and of the many nights previous to that, his monologue, interrupted often by his tears and silences, was met with feigned understanding and sideways glances. He told the story over several times, however, despite their condescension, and they, looking no doubt for a clue among his lunatic fables as to the reality of Billy Tate's Houdini act, attended every word. When they found nothing among his tales to advance their investigations, they began to lose their tempers with him. Consolation was replaced with threats. They demanded, voices louder each time they asked the question, where Billy had gone. Cleve answered the only way he knew how. "To the city," he told them. "He's a murderer, you see." "And his body?" the governor said. "Where do you suppose his body is?" Cleve didn't know and said so. It wasn't until much later, 4 full days later in fact, that he was standing by the window watching the gardening detail bearing this spring's plantings cross between wings that he remembered the lawn. He found Mayflower, who had been returned to B Wing in lieu of Devlin, and told the officer the thought that had come to him. "He's in the grave," he said. "He's with his grandfather, Smoke and Shadow." They dug up the coffin by cover of night, an elaborate shield of poles and tarpaulins erected to keep the proceedings from prying eyes, and lamps, bright as day but not so warm, trained on the labors of the men volunteered as an exhumation party. Cleve's answer to the riddle of Tate's disappearance had met with almost universal bafflement, but no explanation, however absurd, was being overlooked in a mystery so intractable. Thus they gathered at the unmarked grave to turn earth that looked not to have been disturbed in 5 decades. The governor, a selection of Home Office officials, a pathologist, and Devlin. One of the doctors, believing that Cleve's morbid delusion would be best countered if he viewed the contents of the coffin and saw his error with his own eyes, convinced the governor that Cleve should also be numbered among the spectators. There was little in the confines of Edgar St. Clair Tate's coffin that Cleve had not seen before. The corpse of the murderer, returned here, as smoke perhaps, neither quite beast nor quite human, and preserved, as the bishop had promised, as undecayed as the day of his execution, shared the coffin with Billy Tate, who lay, naked as a babe, in his grandfather's embrace. Edgar's corrupted limb was still wound around Billy's neck, and the walls of the coffin were dark with congealed blood. But Billy's face was not besmirched. "He looks like a doll," one of the doctors observed. Cleve wanted to reply that no doll had such tear stains on its cheeks, nor such despair in its eyes, but the thought refused to become words. Cleve was released from Pentonville 3 weeks later after special application to the parole board, with only 2/3 of his sentence completed. He returned within half a year to the only profession that he had ever known. Any hope he might have had of release from his dreams was short-lived. The place was with him still, neither so focused nor so easily traversed now that Billy, whose mind had opened that door, was gone, but still a potent terror, the lingering presence of which wearied Cleve. Sometimes the dreams would almost recede completely, only to return again with terrible potency. It took Cleve several months before he began to grasp the pattern of this vacillation. People brought the dream to him. If he spent time with somebody who had murderous intentions, the city came back. Nor were such people so rare. As he grew more sensitive to the lethal streak in those around him, he found himself scarcely able to walk the street. They were everywhere, these embryonic killers. People wearing smart clothes and sunny expressions were striding the pavement and imagining, as they strode, the deaths of their employers and their spouses, of soap opera stars and incompetent tailors. The world had murder on its mind, and he could no longer bear its thoughts. Only heroin offered some release from the burden of experience. He had never done much intravenous H, but it rapidly became heaven and earth to him. It was an expensive addiction, however, and one which his increasingly truncated circle of professional contacts could scarcely hope to finance. It was a man called Grimm, a fellow addict so desperate to avoid reality he could get high on fermented milk, who suggested that Cleve might want to do some work to earn him a fee the equal of his appetite. It seemed like a wise idea. A meeting was arranged and a proposal put. The fee for the job was so high it could not be refused by a man so in need of money. The job, of course, was murder. "There are no visitors here, only prospective citizens." He had been told that once, though he no longer quite remembered by whom, and he believed in prophecies. If he didn't commit murder now, it would only be a matter of time until he did. But though the details of the assassination that he undertook had a terrible familiarity to him, he had not anticipated the collision of circumstances by which he ended fleeing from the scene of his crime barefoot and running so hard on pavement and tarmac that by the time the police cornered him and shot him down, his feet were bloody and ready at last to tread the streets of the city, just as he had in dreams. The room he'd killed in was waiting for him, and he lived there, hiding his head from any who appeared in the street outside for several months. He assumed time passed here by the beard he'd grown, though sleep came seldom, and day never. After a while, however, he braved the cool wind and the butterflies and took himself off to the city perimeters, where the houses petered out and the desert took over. He went, not to see the dunes, but to listen to the voices that came always rising and falling like the howls of jackals or children. He stayed there a long while, and the wind conspired with the desert to bury him. But he was not disappointed with the fruit of his vigil. For one day, or year, he saw a man come to the place and drop a gun in the sand, then wander out into the desert, where, after a while, the makers of the voices came to meet him, loping and wild, dancing on their crutches. They surrounded him, laughing. He went with them, laughing, and though distance and the wind smudged the sight, Cleve was certain he saw the man picked up by one of the celebrants and taken onto its shoulders as a boy, thence snatched into another's arms as a baby, until, at the limit of his senses, he heard the man bawl as he was delivered back into life. He went away content, knowing at last how sin and he had come into the world.